I remember watching people walk into a collection center carrying their wedding rings. Not because anyone ordered them to, because the country needed something, and somehow that was enough. That was 1998. South Korea was in the middle of a financial crisis, and ordinary people were lining up to hand over their gold. Rings, medals, a grandmother's necklace. Things you keep for a lifetime, passed across a folding table to a stranger. I was old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to watch my parents carry the weight of it, the quieter dinners, the conversations that stopped when I walked into the room, the particular stillness that settles into a house when money becomes a question. I understood the crisis through my family before I understood it through the news. And what I remember most is not the fear. It is the other thing that moved alongside the fear. The lines at the collection centers, the strangers handing over what they had saved, the feeling underneath all of it. It was the feeling of uri, ours. In Korean, that word appears where English would expect my, our mother, our house, our country. I grew up inside that word without ever stopping to look at it. It was so close to the skin that it almost disappeared. This is only how it looked from where I stood. But when I finally stopped and turned back towards that word, I realized I had been living inside more than a habit of speech. I had been living inside a way of belonging. I learned our mother before I learned almost anything else, not as a concept, not as a cultural value, as a room. That was how my mother was named in daily speech, not my mother, our mother. Even when I was the only one in the conversation, even when the person I was talking to had never met her. At the time, nothing about that felt strange. The word moved through the house the way warmth moves through a building. You don't notice it until you step outside. It was in the food that appeared without being asked for, in the way someone always knew when you hadn't eaten, in the front door opening before dinner, in the voice from the kitchen, in the assumption that you would be there. Our was the grammar of that assumption, not a declaration, not a principle, not even a choice, just the shape of belonging before belonging needed a name. I didn't grow up thinking, I live in a collective culture. I grew up thinking, this is what home feels like. And maybe that is why the word stayed invisible for so long. The things closest to us are often the last ones we see clearly. You don't stop in the middle of your own childhood to ask what kind of architecture made it feel safe. You simply live inside it. Before our became a question, it was simply the atmosphere of home. But our doesn't stay inside the home, it travels. Our school, our teacher, our company, our country. The circle grows larger, but the sentence still begins from inside. Take our teacher, for example. In Korean, you say our teacher even in a conversation with someone who has never met that teacher, never attended that school, shares nothing of that world. No actual we in the room, and yet our is still the instinctive word. Because the speaker is not describing a group, they are announcing a position. I come from somewhere. This is where I stand. That warmth is real. But somewhere inside all those hours, I began to hear something else. Not immediately, gradually. The way you start to hear a second melody in a song you thought you already knew. Because our does more than say, I am not alone. Sometimes it also says, look where I stand. Our company with the name people recognize. Our school that was difficult to enter. Our neighborhood that means something before I've said anything else about myself. Now, the impulse to borrow scale from a group, that is not uniquely Korean. It is probably as old as human belonging itself. People everywhere absorb the status of their institution, their neighborhood, their tribe. But in a culture built so fundamentally on relation, where comparison is not a private habit, but something closer to a structural reflex, our does particular work. The competition doesn't stay between individuals, it migrates into the collective. Our side against theirs, we against them. And the line that our draws between inside and outside, between us and you, is somehow thicker, more load-bearing than any line a single person could draw alone. The group makes the boundary feel natural, sometimes even righteous, so the word that begins as warmth can become, in the same breath, a wall. Our begins as shelter. The same word can quietly become a gate. And once you hear that, you start to feel it from the inside. The pressure inside our is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive as a rule or a command. It arrives as a temperature, a sense that the room has already reached its conclusion, and your role is to arrive there too. That difference is not forbidden, it is simply costly. A separate opinion is not punished exactly, it just makes you harder to place. I think of a kind of scene that many Koreans know without naming it, a team dinner. Someone offers a mild dissent, not a confrontation, just a slightly different reading, and the table doesn't argue back, it simply moves on. The conversation continues, almost warmer than before, around the gap where that voice just was. And the person who spoke learned something without being taught it. The room doesn't need you to be wrong, it only needs you to be quieter next time. That is not cruelty, but it is not nothing. There is a kind of unspoken violence in a belonging that works this way, the kind that never raises its voice, never points a finger, only adjusts the temperature of the room until you adjust yourself. I have felt that, not in one dramatic scene, in the accumulation, the things I softened over time, the edges I filed down, the version of myself I learned to lead with, and the version I learned to leave in the hallway. The belonging that our offers is real. So is what you quietly learn to leave at the door.
And then I think about the gold again. Those people in 1998 were not dragged there by law. They came because something in them said, "This is ours, and it is in trouble." Then, much later, I watched something similar happen again. Late one night, a sitting president declared emergency martial law. Within hours, ordinary citizens were already moving, driving to the National Assembly in the dark, standing at the gates before the night had fully explained itself. Not because someone organized them in time, because something moved before the plan did. When I watched that, I felt rage first, the kind that rises before thought, before language, and then, as more people kept coming, something closer to pride, the almost unbearable feeling that we were doing this, that we were actually doing this. But the feeling I am trying to name now is not pride. It is something quieter, something I only felt later, sitting with all of it from a little further back. Because this is a country still navigating the distance between its ideals and its institutions, between the principles written into its laws and the justice that people can actually reach. A country whose outward form has modernized faster than its inner workings have followed. And yet, something in this society produces that movement, that readiness, that willingness to go out in the dark for something larger than any single person's interest. Where does that come from? Is it the same hour that makes silence feel like loyalty? Is the force that fills a plaza on a freezing night the same force that makes difference feel dangerous on an ordinary Tuesday? I keep asking. I still don't know. The hour that moves people toward justice and the hour that keeps people quiet, I cannot find the seam between them. I want to separate them. I want to take the warmth and leave the pressure, take the solidarity and leave the conformity, keep the people who drove to the assembly in the dark and lose the atmosphere that makes it expensive to be different at a team dinner. That is what I want, but I am honestly not sure it is possible. Because the closeness that makes people show up for each other, that same closeness is what makes deviation feel like abandonment. The bond that moves people without a plan in a crisis, that same bond is what makes silence feel like loyalty when there is no crisis at all. Can we not have a culture where people move toward each other in the dark, and also have a culture where no one has to make themselves smaller to stay inside the hour? I want the answer to be yes. I want to believe those two things are separable, that the solidarity is the real hour and the pressure is only a distortion of it. But I'm not sure.
And then something shifts when I look at those moments differently. Maybe the force that showed up in those crises was never the collective as such. Maybe it was always the individuals inside it. The ones who were quiet most of the time, who went to work and came home and didn't make speeches, but who, at a certain moment, decided that something mattered more than staying comfortable. One person, then another, then another. The hour that formed in those moments wasn't the hour that pressures you to agree. It was the hour that forms when people who each made a private choice happen to make the same one. And I wonder if that distinction is the one that matters most. Maybe the health of a collective culture depends not on strengthening the hour, but on protecting the individuals inside it, the ones who are different, the ones who are quieter than the room expects, the ones who might, at the right moment, be the only ones willing to move first. If hour can hold those people, really hold them, without asking them to disappear, then maybe it becomes something worth keeping. I want to keep the shelter without the debt, the warmth without the obedience. I don't know yet if that is possible, but I know which uri I am still reaching for. I still change our mother when I subtitle it. I write my mother because English asks for it, because it reads correctly there. But every time I make that change, I notice something shift in the line. Not the meaning, the posture. Something in the sentence straightens, something steps out of the room. In Korean, I learn to speak from inside a bond. In English, I am asked to step outside the bond first and then name it. Neither is wrong, but they do not leave the speaker standing in the same place. There is an image I keep coming back to, a winter protest, a plaza covered in snow, hundreds of people wrapped in silver emergency blankets, waiting out the cold, not going home. What moves me is not the scale, it is the stillness, each person a separate point of heat,
holding their own warmth, and yet somehow our. Not because they were told to be, not because they all agreed on everything, but because they were each, privately, willing to be cold for the same reason. And that leaves me with a question I still cannot settle. When our asks you to show up, how do you know if it is calling for your courage or your silence? Maybe I will spend a long time with that question. Maybe that is what it means to live inside a language, not to master it, but to keep hearing what it is asking of you. Udi. Still the most loaded word I know.